I'm not saying don't share. I'm not saying gatekeep, but like you do have to consider the factors because like, again, this is our livelihood. There are very real consequences. We're in the middle of social change, which means while there's some progress on one end and we're seeing the benefits of more wage transparency and salary transparency, there is still very much an old guard at the helm. Rich and Regular podcast where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Julian. And today we're talking about pay transparency, aka telling people how much money you make.
Yes.
Right. But before we do that, I want to give a huge shout out to Values 18. Values 18. They left us a 5-star review. I want to give a little shout out to them. Thank you. Shout out to Values 18. I want to read this review because it was very poetic. They said, almost every episode so far has prompted me to consider how to think and talk about the topics. I also love that they are so conversational. I feel like we could be enjoying a good meal, stimulating conversation, and some laughs while learning and growing towards our financial freedom. And this holiday episode just made me laugh at certain points. Peace is a beautiful gift, and knowing our values can be how we gift it to ourselves.
Yes.
So appreciate y'all.
Oh, Values 18.
Very Hallmark card-ish.
Yes.
I really appreciate that.
I love when people get the format of the podcast because, you turn on like a money podcast and you expect to like have your notepad out.
Right.
Versus just like listening to people talk and wanting to weigh in with your own perspective like you're at a table. Like,
yeah, and that was intentional. Like that's exactly how we want you guys to feel. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone else. We had a really nice surge coming off the last episode.
Yes.
So keep that coming. We really, really appreciate it. We see it and we want more.
Greedy.
We are. Okay, I want to jump into this because there are a couple of reasons why I really wanted to talk about this. And the first one was I was a little blown away by the fact that I remember that if we were having this conversation about 10 years ago, I would have had a completely different point of view on how important or how immediate I felt that pay transparency needed to be implemented and brought into the mainstream. Because back then, it didn't feel like it was something that a lot of people were talking about enough, if at all, if I'm being honest. And so that's something that I've definitely noticed. The second one is that I don't actually think now that things have changed that people are aware of how this particular issue has begun to really take shape over the last decade and how it might actually be impacting the company or the industry or the state that they live in, because a lot has changed just over the last couple of years. And then the third one is that even from a personal or interpersonal kind of relationship or familial standpoint, I don't think a lot of people really give a lot of thought to the role that pay transparency or money transparency plays in their relationships. And it absolutely does. And so for all of those reasons, I really wanted to dive into this particular subject today. And my first thought is actually a question for you, which is more so, like, have you ever shared like how much money or your salary that you've made with anyone?
No, I mean, yes, I have shared it with people, but it's been selective. I don't have this rule that like I talk about it, and I certainly don't feel as like loosey-goosey as some of the younger folks where they just like put it on the internet and whatnot.
Did you just say younger folks?
Younger folks, yeah, you know.
Okay.
But I think that's because of like the time that I was coming of age in my career. At that time, benefits of sharing your salary was not like as clear. It wasn't encouraged, and that there were like real consequences to just talking openly about your salary.
Yeah.
And I also started my career in an HR position, and I kind of learned how the sausage is made and how hiring decisions and compensation are cobbled together.
Yeah.
And I learned firsthand that while companies usually have a standard practice for establishing salary bands and ranges for positions or departments, individual salaries are highly subjective. Like it is not like, I'm following this checklist and this is where we land.
It's a lot more art than science.
Yes,
that
exactly.
people want to give credit to. But so I agree. But
but like at the same time, I know that one of the main arguments for more pay transparency is to make those biases, that art in hiring and compensation, more public, and add pressure to change it and make it more fair. Like I can remember the first time I read about the wage gap. which explains the difference between marginalized people and like what the top of the pyramid makes, like white men. And I remember learning that Black women stand to lose almost $1 million in salary simply because of the wage gap, not because of a difference in experience or credentials. It was just because we're paid differently. We're paid less. And I remember being radicalized by that. I remember that being like a main jumping point to my journey of cashing out. So I do feel like a little bit of a hypocrite because I don't actively like share my salary knowing that there's this gap. But I also tell myself it's not my responsibility to do the revealing. That's for them and not for me.
Yeah, radicalized is an interesting word because I think I can relate to that. I remember reading stats like that. And then once I finally connected the dots and realized the role that a lack of pay transparency played and the role that it played in basically suppressing wages, that's when I realized, like, oh no, this is not cool, because I was on the losing side of this equation. And I was like, yeah, no, this can't be real. But I will also say, you know, I'm sitting there making jokes, aging you. But like, as I think about like Gen Z and some of the conversations that we've had, even as entrepreneurs, you know, like there's a very clear difference. You can tell, like they are very much more open, at least the ones that we've met and the ones that we've collaborated with, like far more open and willing to exchange details about those things. And I always, every time it happens, I always remember being a little like,
sure?
I don't wear pearls, but I'm like, they clutch some pearls. Like, oh my God, did that slip out? Like, no, you just shared this information. But it always makes me think about a lot of the counsel, the well-meaning counsel that we give younger people around jobs. And we tell them, yeah, you should go to school. Yeah, you should do these things so that you make good money, right? That in and of itself is, to me, is like a form of like pay transparency, because you're just saying good money, but like the details matter, right?
Yeah,
like,
they do.
How much is good? Like, is it good up front? Is it good
over time?
Immediately?
With tenure?
When you say time, is that 5 years, 10 years? Like, you know, it really, really matters. And those kinds of details, I think, kind of fall right in line with why I wanted to have this conversation, because I think that in addition to the pay transparency, like there's also the taboo of talking about money, and all of these things ultimately play a critical role in why people aren't being paid more than what they're being paid today. Now, the good news is there is some data on this, and LinkedIn conducted a survey to see what the differences in points of view around pay transparency were across generations. And to no one's surprise, boomers are not big fans of
boomers
pay
ain't
transparency.
saying nothing.
They were like, yeah, no, we don't play
What's that?
Yeah. No, didn't sign up for that at all. And Gen Z is literally on the other end of the spectrum. So here's kind of how that broke down. They asked several questions, but one of the questions I'll focus on was around who, if anyone, would you share your pay information with? And 25% of boomers said no one.
Wow.
15% of Gen X said no one. 7% of millennials, our people, said no one. And just 4% of Gen Z said no one, right? Like, of course, I'll share that information with anyone, whoever asks, basically. And when they broke it down by family members and coworkers and friends and mentors, you can kind of see that willingness change a little bit for each generation. But it was really interesting to kind of see, we'll link to it in the show notes, how the responses changed by generation and how they treated, let's say, a coworker versus a peer who is a coworker. There were subtle differences in that. But generally speaking, with only a few, I would say, discrepancies where millennials were like on par or a little bit more, Gen Z is by far leading the way in terms of their willingness to share details about their pay.
And why do you think that is? Why is Gen Z so open?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for it. And this is not based on survey. This is just based on my own experience. I think there are a couple of things. I think one, just culturally, they're just far more comfortable joking about it. Like, if you pay attention, I'm not on TikTok and I don't spend any time on TikTok, but I do spend some time on YouTube, and you start to see like these little reels or memes, like basically like there's this whole thing where they just walk up to somebody and say,
oh, it's called a street interview with the little mic.
Yes,
the
with
tiny
the little
mic.
tiny microphone. And to me, I always find it interesting, not because I care about what people are saying, because I think actually half the time people are lying, like, if we're being honest. But I think it's interesting because it just speaks to the role that this plays in their lives, right? Like, and I think every generation has that. And so that's one of the things that I think is really just important here, is that this is just a part of their culture.
Yeah, they walk up to people with these tiny little microphones and ask them, what do you do for a living and how much money you make?
Yeah.
Or if you're driving a nice car,
Yep.
they'll say, how much did you pay for that? And
Quick
what do you
little
do for a living?
Tap on the window and
Yeah.
say, wow, I love your car. This is amazing. Hey, or, maybe you've seen someone shouting to someone who was standing on a yacht.
Yeah.
And they're asking the question like, hey, oh my gosh, what do you do for a living, right? So it's very much a part of their culture. They're very open in that way. And so I think it's not surprising to see that this is starting to make its way into the workforce. And with that in mind, I think every workforce or every generation rather does that, right? So boomers, I would imagine, I'm trying to give boomers some credit here. And I was trying to think about the best way to draw this parallel, but I would imagine there was a time where boomers were introducing cutting edge technology.
Oh yeah, it's called middle management.
Well,
They created the
I'm not
career
trying
path.
to be funny. I was
No,
going
I'm
to say
serious.
typewriters. There had to have been a time where some generation, maybe it wasn't boomers, but they were introducing like typewriters and like they were probably bragging about the speed in which they can write words per minute in a workforce where there were significant amounts of people who were much more proud of, let's say, their penmanship and their note-taking, right? And so I think a lot of this is just sort of a sign of the times, right? There's always going to be a change, a shift in the landscape. Each generation adopts those things, and Gen Z just kind of has their bone to pick. Millennials had their bone to pick, which is why we kind of gave birth to the idea of social responsibility. Gen X sort of introduced work-life balance a little bit. And so I think Gen Z has their bone to pick. And so a lot of it I think is just kind of natural. Like they found this thing that they're passionate about. They're willing to fight for it. And, for all intents and purposes, I say, good luck. I'm rooting for you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny because it does make me remember when millennials were the ones who were labeled difficult in the workplace because we came in with these ideas of like open concept and teamwork and, everybody gets the trophy and social responsibility. And so like here Gen Z is, coming into the workforce, and not only do they want to work remote, they also want a 4-day work week and they want to know how much money everybody makes. And so, I do agree with you that this happens with every generation, but I also think that there is a rite of passage for every generation to learn how inhospitable the labor market is. We come into these jobs with these grand ideas of how they should reflect the world that we want to build. And then we put all this energy into our workplaces instead of into our congressmen and into our labor laws.
Yeah.
And so I understand the push, but I also understand the pushback because there's really two different ways that you can approach pay transparency. You can do it top down and you can do it bottom up. Top down is kind of that more legally sanctioned and market driven approach, but bottom up is more culturally driven by the people for the people, right? Yeah. It's a grassroots effort. Now, to be clear, I am a fan of top-down salary transparency. I do believe that companies should include a salary range for every new position that they post. And I think we're starting to see traction on that front with new laws that are being created in places like New York, major job markets where the job postings have to have the salary disclosed. I think that's a great first step because, it'll be weird to tell Bo that we used to apply to jobs and didn't know how much they paid.
So to that point, as we were preparing for this conversation, I thought about just how challenging it is for people to even negotiate or to prepare or how much of a waste of time it is. I remember the last time I went through that experience, I was like, man, I'm really stepping out on faith here.
Yeah.
Based on something that I've heard from someone else who works in the company, like this team, this particular role pays somewhere in this ballpark, but it was not listed.
Yeah.
It was not listed. And I would ask and they didn't share that information. They wouldn't share it yet. It was almost like earn your way up to a point of even being able to ask the question, which I felt a bit, it felt very exploitative.
Yeah.
And that there was very little value for my time as a candidate. But
yeah. So that's top down. Now, where Zoomers push me outside of my comfort zone.
I did not know they were called Zoomers.
Yeah.
If I were Gen Z, I wouldn't be a Zoomer.
A Zoomer?
No.
I think it's cute.
I'd stick with Gen Z.
Where the Zoomers push me outside of my comfort zone is that they are advocating for this bottom-up approach where you and me as colleagues, as friends, as people who are just on a date, tell each other how much we make all the time. Or in some cases, that I disclose it on the internet whenever I'm talking about my money or things that I might buy for myself. And, for the record, the bottom-up approach is not new. There have been sites like Glassdoor and Indeed that have existed for at least 15 years, at least as long as I've been in the workforce. And these sites take the same intent of wanting to share information and they kind of crowdsource it. So people can still research it without all of this individualized pressure to reveal something that you may feel is private information. I'm not saying that Zoomers invented bottom-up approach. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that it is a different addition to a conversation or connecting with people that I'm not used to.
Yeah, I will also say this. I'm going to call him, I can't call him a Zoomer, but one of the interesting things that I think is also going to play a role in this, it's actually, I understand why a lot of these research surveys are doing it, but it's arguably irrelevant to even be comparing, boomers to Gen Z, because as early as next year, 2024, studies are projecting that Zoomers, Gen Z, will be larger than boomers in the workplace. And so with numbers comes your point of view and all of those things happening anyway. And so you could argue this is very much about to be a thing. And I think we're having this conversation talking about these two opposite ends of the spectrum, but this is really more so relevant for Gen X and millennials who might not necessarily be fans of this approach. It's by saying, well, yeah, great millennials, you're great. You're now the largest party, the largest group. But just keep in mind that there's some things that we, generally speaking, don't quite agree on, and they absolutely are fighting for. I do think that this boils down to, again, from a workplace standpoint, we're talking about workplace culture, but culturally, we're talking about busting taboos. And I can say from personal experience, as people who have done this and have been working on this for over 10 years, it can be really, really tough. I feel like I'm totally aging myself. I remember the days where I was very much a bull in a china shop, and I was all about not repeating or not perpetuating so many of the things that I knew have historically harmed people or led to poor outcomes for large groups of people, especially around things like pay, because I felt like the implications of perpetuating these things were so harmful. So I fully understand why Gen Z is fighting as hard as they can. But I will also say that being the bull in the china shop comes with, you don't leave the china shop without some scars. And so when I reflect back on my corporate experience, I know for a fact that there have been times where I've missed out on promotions, where I've been labeled difficult, where I didn't get a role and it was just because of fit, right? And there may have been other issues, but I think, these kinds of things, my willingness to speak up against these kinds of issues, or in some cases, just try to hold an organization accountable for actually fulfilling the values that they say they stood for, those things come at a very, very real cost. You miss out on roles. People don't feel like dealing with it. They don't want to bring you on. Or in some cases, they allow those points of view to overshadow your capabilities and the other things that you bring to the table. And I think that ultimately this is about power. There are people who have power, they are in power, they fought to get that power, and they're not really willing to give it up. They understand when you break some of these things, that when you break the code of conduct, that those things oftentimes lead to power being issued into other parts of the organization. And that comes at a cost to them. And so this is really a bit of a power struggle. And so again, I would say to Gen Z and really anyone that's out there just fighting for it, especially, that just wants to be leading in the next generation, keep pushing, but prepare for battle.
Yeah.
Because a shift of power does not come easily, and it certainly is not free.
No. And it's never given. And you always got to take it.
You have to take it.
One place I think that they got right is about educating people about our rights, right? So I think most people aren't aware that under the National Labor Relations Act, it is illegal for most, no, not all, but for most employers to restrict you from talking about your pay. If you are an employee who is covered by the act, your right to discuss your salary is protected by law. Full stop.
Yeah.
Now, according to their website, there are some exclusions like federal, state, and local government employees and a few others, but most American workers are protected by law. You can talk about your salary. Now, That being said, your employer can restrict the way that you talk about it and where you talk about it. So they can create policies that say things like, you can't talk about it in front of customers, or you can't talk about it on the clock, or, you can't use my equipment to talk about it, or on social media. So, they can't blanket restrict you from talking about it. It's also illegal for them to retaliate against you for speaking about your salary, but they can add policy about the context in which you discuss it.
Yeah.
Right. So, kudos to the Zoomers, Gen Z, for reminding people of our rights. Now, for those of us who have been around the block for a minute, you get to that age where you got to start removing some of your workplace experience because you want your resume to fit on one page. That's who I'm talking to right now. For those of us who have been around for a minute, you know that there is a huge difference between what is legally allowed in theory and what is encouraged
I was about to say.
in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So although it is illegal for them to do all this stuff, you know what it is. And you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a policy that the military used to have, legally sanctioned, that made it illegal to discriminate against closeted LGBTQ service members. You could not discriminate. You could not harass them. But it prohibited openly gay, lesbian, or bi people from serving in the military. Now, that policy was later repealed, but the confusion of implementing this half-ass effort led to a lot of trauma for the people who were affected by it. They still talk about the fear of being outed because they lived under this policy, and the lingering effects are still there. There are still people who serve in our military who are members of the LGBTQ community and don't openly profess that because they're still worried about being outed and experiencing consequences. And so while these aren't the same issues, the fear of losing your livelihood and being blackballed or retaliated against in the workplace is very real. Yeah. And again, there are plenty of stories, especially from people with marginalized identities, who have asked for more money and are immediately reprimanded. I mean, we both have stories where asking for money based on what we know other people have been paid for the exact same work has backfired. Even now as creators, not just when we were in the traditional workforce. It still happens even in this capacity. And I don't think that we discuss the shame that creates. Now, to be fair, we have also had a few stories where a client has raised our rate to match what other people have quoted because they noticed the discrepancy. They noticed that we were quoting lower than other people. So it's really a toss-up, but based on the historical biases in the workplace and the very clear, still apparent and growing wage gap, we know that for some of us, the odds just aren't there, or they're not going to be in our favor if you just come out and ask for money just because somebody else makes more.
Yeah. So many thoughts on that. But I think my first one is really going back to what you were saying around don't ask, don't tell, because I think it's important that we put that into context. So let's keep it 100. Like, there were without question a lot of people who were pro. Like it was not uncommon to have been a part of the LGBTQ community back then and to be pro don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I just think
it felt like progress.
It felt like this is progress.
It felt like a compromise.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so I just think that it's really interesting to kind of, that we think about this issue. And obviously, we're not talking like apples to apples here, but the point that I'm making is that there are different paths to progress. It takes time to get there. And just because a policy exists or doesn't exist doesn't necessarily mean that that is a full reflection of how the majority of people are feeling. There might have actually been some benefits to a certain policy not being in place or being in place. And that will always be the case, right? Like, we're not going to profess that there is a perfect solution. Maybe there is, maybe someone has come up with it, but we certainly are not tasked with trying to come up with that today. It's really just a matter of bringing it to an issue, talking about both sides of it, and then being able to say, like, wow, like, there's a lot to consider here. Let's make sure that from a financial perspective, from a career perspective, we're prepared for both, because things could go either way. Going back to what I was saying earlier on in the episode, in terms of interpersonal or relationship effects of pay transparency, I'll speak from my own personal experience. I remember there was a time in my corporate experience towards the latter part where I had a coworker and I learned just how much more he was being paid than me. And it didn't bother me. Like, I didn't all of a sudden, I wasn't upset about it, and I wasn't upset at my boss for that. Like, I understood he had more experience than I did, but what did bother me was when I started to reflect on all the times that I had helped him, because this was very much a one-sided kind of dynamic, right? And so it was like, well, I don't agree with this part, right? Like, I'm totally fine with the fact that we all kind of bring something to the table, but I don't ask you for help really at all. And you are regularly asking me for help. And so to now learn that you are paid significantly more than me, all of a sudden just did not sit well with me. But even then, I didn't take it out on him because, like, you know, there's really no value in that. And like, again, we're cool. I didn't take it out on my boss. I was just sort of upset at the system that this kind of dynamic existed at all, because it kind of felt like there were these things that were being said to us from leaders and from the company in terms of what they stand for. But then they would just allow these things to coexist despite impact that they would have thought that it could have on the team dynamic. And that, going back to your earlier point, was one of the other things, like, not that I needed another reason, but it was certainly one of the things that I just completely fundamentally disagreed with, and was one of the reasons, or the contributing reasons, as to why we ultimately decided to pursue financial independence. Now, I am also not alone in this sentiment with respect to, like, feeling resentment, or what's the corporate word? Less engaged. I was disengaged with work, but like, there's some research around this. So studies have shown that the satisfaction you have with your income is relative, to those around you. And I think this is particularly apparent when you think about people who live in places that are concentrated with high earners. So like, you think about New York or like Silicon Valley, like, those people, even though they may make a lot of money, and certainly a lot of money relative to people who don't live in these high concentrated, high earning areas, they still don't feel like they're rich. And we talked about this in our book. We've met people like this. It's like, what do you mean? I don't understand. Because they're comparing themselves to people who are like ultra rich.
Right.
And like making like ridiculous amounts of money, right? So it just goes to speak that like income and the comfort level, the confidence that you have with that income, and even your wealth, is all relative. You could be completely satisfied with your income. Maybe it's the most that you've ever made, but the minute you find out that somebody else, like in my case, makes like 20% more than you, all of a sudden these feelings of resentment start to come into play. And so like, there's something to it. Again, it speaks to the broader issue, or the broader consequence of pay transparency, and the impact that it has on teamwork, and then the downstream effect that teamwork may have on a team or a company's ability to achieve any particular objective. But I think these are the kinds of things that are the result of the way that things are right now. And again, even with all of that said, there's a bit of a double-edged sword here. You know what I mean? Because we know what happens when there's pay opacity, right? We know that it means that there is a built-in level of teamwork, or I would say a greater likelihood that there's a built-in level of teamwork, and people are much more willing to do it. But you got to think about it. If you notice somebody is making 20, 30% more than you, and then they're asking you for help,
Child.
I'm willing to bet that most people would be a little less willing to lend a hand to the person that they know is going to be making significantly more than them, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something to teamwork and work culture as a whole that actually benefits from this particular issue. So I could kind of see both sides of it.
Yeah, because if you've worked in corporate America, you know that the goodwill of your colleagues or people who work in other departments to give you information, you know, you need the finance person to run this report, you need the procurement person to pull up this invoice.
Your ability to know those people is in part what makes you a valuable person.
Absolutely.
And you can also negotiate, you know, a higher salary because of those relationships. And so like, it's a really big issue, but go ahead.
But if your salary, if them knowing your salary makes them less likely to want to help you, that kind of stunts your growth. And I don't think people think about that. Whenever we talk about pay transparency, they assume they're on the short end of the stick, but you could find out that you're making more than everybody else.
Oh yeah.
Imagine that. Now you're the one with the target on your back. The jokes that you make about taking a long lunch don't hit the same when you're the big money. Like now you're the one that's not being considered for promotions, or your emails are going to the bottom of the inbox. In some cases, like you even catch yourself a fresh case of imposter syndrome, because they've also done studies on how we perceive our performance in the workplace. Whenever there is a survey and employees are asked, like, how do you perform? The majority of employees, like well over 60%, say that they are the top performers or that they exceed expectations. And because of that, we all believe that we deserve, air quote, these big old salaries, right? We say that we earn it because we work our butts off, that we're top performers. And maybe you did, but it's also a bit of a delusion because there can only be so many top performers.
Yeah.
The top 10% of your company is literally just 10% of employees. Now, the other 90% aren't bad people, but they are not top performers by definition, by the nature of the word. And so if you are in the top percent, the pressure to stay on top because you've attached all of this meaning and significance to your pay and your performance, whether it's true or not, can lead to burnout and a whole host of other side effects. But if you're not a top performer, but a top performer finds out that you're paid more than them, it creates this cultural issue. And it's almost a domino effect where people are no longer motivated to try because you don't get paid.
I feel like what we're really uncovering here is that because of this particular issue, we have culturally found all of these little ways to work around it and make it a little bit more tolerable, if you will. But even though in the long run, to your point, especially with respect to Black women, I'm sure there are other groups out there, but that's the point that you made, that there is a real cost to this particular issue. And I think that's part of the reason why so many people are fighting. I will also say this, as we were preparing to wrap up, just because you're paid less does not make it unfair or discriminatory, because I think a lot of people might be hearing this episode and saying, oh, wow, that may, of course, be the reason why I'm not paid nearly as much as this other person. And that's not necessarily the case, right? So we're not charging you up here to sort of start beating down the drum. Make sure that you have established a rationale for why you feel that you should be paid more. Like those rules, I think, still stand. And so you need to be looking at all of the factors that actually go into determining how much you're being paid and ultimately whether or not it's even worth it to tell someone else your salary. And so a couple of things that I would call out. First is start with the company. And so find out if your company explicitly shares how compensation is determined or if it's opaque, right? Every company has a policy on that, but that will allow you to get a full understanding of what happens. And you can likely get that information from someone in HR who is a comp specialist or a comp manager or something like that. The second thing is I think we have to really be honest about grading ourselves and the process that we go through in order to do that. And so I think most people are familiar with a breakdown in earning potential relative to like the breadth of your experience, right? So there are
people focus on the years of experience versus like the type of experience.
Correct. I think most people look at that. And again, guilty as charged. I remember that being the thing and say, well, I get it. He's worked for 15 to 20 years. I've only done it for 3. But today, these things are more important. And I was right in that regard, right? But I was very resentful because someone was almost being rewarded for having hung around a little bit long, regardless of the value that they were actually bringing from my perspective. But some of the other things that these companies often do is they're not just looking at the years of experience. They're looking at the projects that that person has done, the value of those projects, right? Because you can work on one project that doesn't really have like top line or like really meaningful importance to the company, but some others don't. It could be your degree. Did you go to an Ivy League school? Did you go to a state school like me, right? Some of those things oftentimes do have an impact. Your willingness to relocate, your ability to manage people, your experience managing people. How many people did you manage, right? How large was your team relative to somebody else?
Were they all in America?
Were
Did
they
you
all
manage a global team?
Was it a global team,
Yeah.
right? And so all of those other things do have an impact on your pay range and your earning potential. And so those are all of the things there. So don't just look at that number, find out that number, look at somebody else, find someone that you're upset at and say, hey, I think that's unfair and therefore I want to leave this company or I want to have a difficult conversation with my boss or with HR. I just think that there's a little bit more work and homework that people need to do in order to frame up their argument for more money or even greater transparency.
I love that point because I think we have to be careful about using pay transparency as shorthand for, I know how much money you make.
Right.
That part is just a means to an end. If we're going to advocate for transparency, we should ask for it across the board and not just regarding the number that they land on. So I love the point of starting with your company first. Now, if your company doesn't share how compensation is determined and you decide to ask your coworkers directly, I really like the script that our friend Erin Lowry offers because they kind of allow you to collect more information that could be helpful without requiring anyone to reveal their salary to you. So the first script that she offers focuses on percentages, and it's something like, hey, I'm thinking about asking for a raise. Does 5% seem reasonable based on what you got the last time? See how it feels different, how that hits different? It's not like, girl, how much money you make? What you get on your review?
Right.
It's more like, does this feel reasonable based on what you got? And the second script that she offers kind of focuses on ranges, and it's something like, hey, I'm about to apply for this senior management role and I'm trying to come up with what salary to ask for. Would you be willing to share your ballpark salary range with me? Now, ideally, that person says something like, I feel like, between 80 and 85K is normal. Or they might say, girl, I wouldn't ask for less than 90K.
Right.
But the point is that you get them in this ballpark range. And you can even lead the witness a little bit and say, like, what's the least you would ask for? Or like, what's the floor that you would ask for to kind of get this perspective? What you do with this information is arguably just as important as getting it to begin with. And so you still need to grade yourself honestly, just like Julian suggested, especially knowing that the bias to overrate our performance exists.
For sure.
Grade yourself honestly.
I'm the best worker ever.
Right. But even more importantly, avoid mentioning their names when you make your case to management. Nobody wants to be thrown under the bus. Nobody wants to be like, well, Julian said that blah, blah, blah. Use this as an independent source of information.
Yeah.
Now, if someone is asking you for the same information, I take the same guidance. If you're uncomfortable revealing the exact numbers, just focus on percentages and ranges. But I'll add one more layer of discernment. Make sure that it's someone that you actually trust with the information.
I was just going to say, because you can have the best script in the world, but like you really only want to have those conversations with people that you already have an established relationship with. And that even if that relationship is established, there has to be a lot of trust there because people are so unfortunately very sensitive with that information. Even just the thought of you asking can be taken the wrong way.
Absolutely.
And then work against you in whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So.
In my mind, they need to go beyond just like an initial trust thing. They need to pass the good hands test.
Oh, for sure.
Like Allstate. If you were giving them something valuable to hold on to, for you, is it in good hands? Like, have they demonstrated reckless behavior in the past? Have you been on the receiving end of gossip from this person?
Listen.
Do you trust that they will put it in the right context? You need to consider all of that information before you pass on your stuff. I'm not saying don't share. I'm not saying gatekeep, but like you do have to consider the factors because like, again, this is our livelihood. There are very real consequences. We're in the middle of social change, which means while there's some progress on one end and we're seeing the benefits of more wage transparency and salary transparency, there is still very much an old guard at the helm.
100%.
Disagreeing with all of the progress and saying we're actually hustling backwards and working against the corporate culture that we've established the last 30 or 40 years.
This is one of those things that is without question an art and a science, right? So you can do all the right things, have all of the right credentials, the right degree from the right place, the correct number of years of experience. That's the science part, right? Like you've applied for a company or for a particular role and it is within the range that you're looking for. That's the science part. But the art is all those other things. And that's where things like fit and, likability and, potential for growth as they see you and all of those things. Like it is highly subjective. It truly is like a CEO or a department head can look you and your team dead in the eye and say, you guys are the most. I feel like everybody has heard that speech at some point, right? You guys are the most important people in the company.
This company wouldn't exist without you.
And they will still turn around and not pay you nearly as much as another team, right? This art in this, you're right. This is their opinion. I do believe that you're important. I give another example. Even in this country, we say things like we value education and safety is our top priority. But does that mean that we pay educators and police officers more than we pay CEOs?
Right.
No, we don't, right? It's very subjective, right? Schools are still underfunded. Departments are still underfunded and so on. It sucks and it's frustrating. And I'm glad that there are people that are out there fighting it. But as I said before, change is slow and you really, really want to prepare for this fight. I think as an entrepreneur, we're probably a bit more comfortable and a bit more used to this irrational, loosey-goosey pricing environment than maybe most W-2 workers are. And so I think we can speak from a certain level of privilege and comfort with that. But my advice for a lot of people, especially for anyone that's listening or watching this, is to really just learn how to navigate both of these worlds, because to your point, we are in a period of change. Like we're in the middle of both. And so it could depend on the company that you're working for. It could depend on the manager that you end up with, where all of a sudden these types of cultural or organizational expectations are suddenly taking effect. And that's why we wanted to make sure that we talked about it today, because whether you're pro salary or pay transparency or against it, the reality is you might be forced to work within an organization that is dealing with both.
Right.
And that's the world that we live in right now. So I want to make sure that everyone out there is prepared for both of those, because I think there's a pretty good chance that you might be dealing with one or the other
in the same company.
In the same company.
Ciao.
In the next couple of years.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The fact is, labor is a market in this country, and markets are highly irrational. And so you can either fight against it or you can embrace it and make it work for you where it can. All right. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. If you like what you heard, let us know. Leave us a 5-star rating and review or drop a comment below. We will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.